Good evening and welcome to another special Island Stat Sports Talk. I'm your host, Earl Baston. Joining me as the president of the Bermuda National Athletic Association, Dr. Freddie Evans, Coach Jerry Swan, and Coach Devon Bean. We're going to be talking about the recently concluded NACAC championships. Gentlemen, we generally haven't taken part in an event like this, but Doc, what was significant about the fact that we wanted to be involved in the NACAC championships in 2022?
Earl, thank you for the question. And once again, thank you for all you do to support sports. The significance was on multiple levels. Let me break it down in three. What I believe is vitally important for our younger athletes to get that experience. We're coming out of 2 years of not having competitions because of COVID. For those who have toiled and given Coach Bean and Coach Swan sweat equity, working through things, to have the opportunity to compete at a senior games amongst some of the best in the world and to find out where they are is immeasurable. For our athletes like Janai and Dej and Tierra, it was a chance to stay right in that mix and find some success. And Janai punched his ticket to Pan Am Games with his performance. So that was very significant. But I do, and I say this wholeheartedly and full-throatedly, to have Devon Bean with his expertise and all the things that he has learned literally at the knee of Coach Swan, and to have Coach Swan with the wealth of talent and knowledge and history and understanding of athletic development as well as officiating, and having Allison as part of a management team with these 10 athletes just showed a different kind of energy and synergy for me. And it told me that we're really on the right track. We're developing some dynamic young people, some dynamic athletes, and under the guidance of these gentlemen and others who contribute to that, we're going to go far.
Yvonne, you've been hands-on with a lot of these athletes throughout their career, especially the ones that took part in the NACAC championships. But seeing the development, where do you see us down the road? With the progress of what you've seen these particular athletes go through.
Good question, Mr. Basin, and I'm going to echo off what Dr. Evans said. We appreciate what you do for all sports, but especially for the sport of athletics. Bermuda right now is in a unique situation as far as track and field. I say that because collectively, I think this is the largest amount of athletes we've had either in boarding school, in college, or university participating in athletics and track and field since, I would say, maybe back in the 70s when Mr. Evans was at university at Jackson State. Mike Watson, Mike Sharps, rest in peace. The list goes on and on. So we're in a very unique and special place because I believe the athletes that we have now, we've somewhat groomed them from a very young age, and the fruits of our labor are finally coming to pass because ever since Troy and Nikki has stopped, it was a large gap. I came along and it was just me, and then it was Xavier James. He had Terrence Armstrongs, and then Tyrone Smith, Trey. So it's becoming a trickling effect, and now we have Dej and Janai that's getting up to elite or world-class level. I think track and field is here to stay, and I believe that we're going to have some Olympic medalists in the sport of athletics in the years to come, very soon.
Mr. Swan, thank you very much for taking the time to come on because, as Dr. Evans said, a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of experience. Your resume goes back a long way and is full When you look at today's athletes and what you were able to get out of the yesteryear athlete, talk about the comparison of what we see today as opposed to what we saw of yesteryear.
When you talk about yesteryear, you're talking about a few different things, Earl. You're talking about what was available. You talk about Carifta Games. Then you talk about Central American and Caribbean Championships. And then you can progress to the Pan American Games. NACAC has come on in recent years. So you also had in the school system much more involvement. Students at various schools were encouraged to get involved with the sport. You had teachers who taught PE teachers who taught the different things, but they recognized the value of track and field. For example, I was a teacher at Berkeley, and in the early 70s and 80s, in particular, the students from Berkeley were very significant in participating in the national program. You think of Debbie Jones, you think of all the Sterling brothers and sisters, Bessie Horton, Carla Godwin, Susan Fox, Donald Watson being Rayner. They were all students at Berkeley, and they were encouraged. Not only did we have a thriving program back then at the school, but they were encouraged to get involved with a national program. I was competing as an athlete. Then you look at Warwick Sack. Out of Warwick Sack around that time, you had people like Cal Dill, Larry Anderson, etc. They were encouraged to get involved in the program. You had Sand Secondary School. That's where Norbert Simons and some of the other athletes came out who got involved with the program. So I think you had a vibrancy in the school system, particularly at high school, with teachers who encourage their students. I don't think that exists, and to that extent today. Dr. Evans mentioned about COVID. So you had that sort of environment, enthusiasm, encouragement, and therefore the number of participants were very much involved. And you had parents involved with what's going on. Parents who came out and who helped to officiate at track meets, parents who organized maybe fundraising functions, etc. So you had those things that exist, and I'm not sure if they exist, and if they do, certainly not to the same extent today as they did back then. So when you look at that, when you look at the late Randy Benjamin, who was instrumental, played a leadership part in helping to develop the sport, that same Mr. Benjamin was one of the catalysts to the introduction of the Carifta Games. So some folks may not know that, but he and Austin Seeley were very significant in the introduction of the Carifta Games. Bermuda was one of the first, I think, 9 or 10 countries who competed in the very first Carifta Games in Barbados in 1972. That number has grown to almost closer to 30 countries participating in Carifta, compared to the 9 or 10 in its earlier original years. So you had those dynamics that existed back then that to a large extent may not exist today. I don't think they exist today with teachers encouraging. I used to regard PE as a subject. I used to encourage students to get involved with track and field. I taught soccer, I taught track and field, I taught cricket, I taught some other activities, basketball. We had other sort of indoor activities, table tennis, badminton, but they were encouraged to get involved with that. It wasn't unusual when the inter-school sports occurred. That occurred during the summer term. And if you may recall, we had the embankment. That was before the arrival of the synthetic track. You had the embankment, the student bodies from the various schools,
Mhm.
Sam's, Warwick, Sac, St. George's, Sac, Northlands, Berkeley. They all used to come out.
Mhm.
They were actively involved as participants in the school uniforms, and of course, supporting the athletes out in their competition attire in those 2 days, etc. So you had all of that going on. I don't think that exists today. So that's a big difference in terms of the enthusiasm, the kind of support and participation, encouragement. So that those are a couple of things.
Sure.
And as a result of that, there was interest in what our athletes were doing.
Mhm.
Debbie Jones was the golden girl for, and that was that, and I say that respectfully because she won so many medals at Carifta.
Mhm.
Debbie and so many others similar to her went on to receive athletic scholarships. Debbie at Tennessee, Cal Dill at Seton Hall, etc. Mike Sharp is in the mix from St. George's Sect. I'm trying to think. Mark Perry was
Yeah.
along with Mike Watson, middle distance runners. So you had that sort of base and people involved as a result of that. There are a bunch of other people whose names escape me right now. So you had those differences
Mhm. Mhm.
between now and then.
Yes.
All
Yeah.
right. But there's no doubt of the importance and significance that track and field has played, can play, not just domestically or nationally or regionally, but also globally.
Mhm.
Track and field is the major sport at Olympic Games. Track and field is a major sport at the Commonwealth Games,
Mhm.
etc. So hopefully I've given an answer to that question that
Yeah,
you
yes, yeah, and more, and more. Devon, let me ask you for the first timers taking part in the NACAC championships at a senior level. What were you hoping or talking to the athletes about to expect? You know, they've done a lot of junior meets, but here's an opportunity to do a senior meet, a regional meet with some of the best athletes in our region and also from around the world, as Dr. Evans has said. What was the expectations of those first timers?
The expectations was to go out there, compete and compete hard. I use an analogy in a team meeting that Mr. Swan and I called, and I go back to the movie Rocky IV, and Rocky was fighting Ivan Drago
Hmm.
in Russia, and during the fight, he cut Ivan Drago, and his trainer looked at him in the eye and said, "You see, he bleeds. He bleeds just like you. He has 2 arms, 2 legs." So I use that analogy because, like you said, some of the athletes are competing against people they see on TV and somewhat idolize, and it was
Yeah.
like they were a deer in headlights. And Mr. Swan and I was trying to control. It's called a controlled aggression. It's all right to be nervous, but you have to kind of learn or channel that aggression or that nervousness into that like fight or flight syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
So more or less trying to keep their nerves calm and reiterating to the athletes that they deserve to be here, they belong here, and they have to believe it.
Mm-hmm. From your standpoint, administration wise, Dr. Evans, how does the BNAA grow from here for next year's NACAC championship? We have a lot of other events that but the regional one, the senior one outside of Carifta, how do we grow from this one to the next one that they have scheduled?
Administratively, we want to ensure that the athletes have opportunity for competitions and the opportunity to reach back into our local coaching staff and get their points and continue to work together. But I think in a bigger picture, or if I may, taking these 10 planted seeds for young people like an Antonio Bailey, who has graduated from college, COVID era, hasn't had a chance to compete, but been working his tail off in Bermuda. See the kid at the track all the time, giving Devon all he can, giving that sweat equity to have the opportunity to go to a senior game. Or a kid like Suresh Black, who same scenario, has to deal with COVID, but Suresh has had some injuries and some other setbacks. And to see him to continue to work at it, because quite frankly, others would quit. But he continued to work at it. And to see him at a senior championship, run 2 personal bests, and to line up in the 200-meter final, And so when he goes next year, when they introduce him, he will be introduced as a NACAC finalist. And so them being there and all the others, they have the appetite and the enthusiasm to go back and do better and perform better. And for those, like we missed Shayla and Caitlin because they were injured and we weren't able to run 4x4 or the mixed 4x4.
Right.
I know they missed that opportunity, but we would have done something significant in one or both of those events if we would have had those young people there. So we got a lot of opportunities. And, you know, I'm really proud of those who went out there and gave it their best and weren't outclassed, like Tara DeRosa. She got to the final and she had 6 very good throws, and they were in the same range, like 46 low, 48 high. That consistency speaks volumes to her training, and it's all going to come along. And Michael Dill getting to a final, to see his confidence grow. Sakari Famous just missing out on a medal. It was a really good opportunity. Sadiq Nurse going and getting the chance to see what he really needs to work on in school. I think he has the desire to do it, but now he knows better that got to work a little bit harder to get to this level. We need to see that. Kid like Katora Bulford Trot, she got to be on the track and see how she could do the 2 and possibly even the 4 next year. And so it was just good. I mean, I could go on, and I don't want to take away from the coaches, but it was significant. They did a great job in organizing and leading them and inspiring them, and it was good to watch.
Sure. Mr. Swan, when we look at the athletes that we have at our disposal today, and the mechanics, I know you and Devon can just stand there and see what mechanically is going wrong. And a lot of people will just say, oh, well, a long jumper is just a person that runs and jumps, hits that board and jumps. But there's so many different technical things that go in, as well as throwing and all. How do we work on the athletes whilst on island to help them improve without competition?
Okay, let me before I address that question, let me go and provide some additional information to your previous question to Coach Bean and Dr. Evans.
Okay.
Athletes cannot improve if they don't have the opportunity, reasonable opportunity to compete.
Mm-hmm.
They need the opportunity to compete and, yes, make mistakes and learn. I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to mention 2 athletes, or I'm going to make reference to a male and female athlete. And I'm going to go back some years ago. Had a female athlete in the long jump at Carifta. And before the team left Bermuda to go to Carifta, we talk about Carifta. Share some information what the Carifta environment is like. The drums and the cowbells provided by the Bahamian supporters, etc. So that, and you share this information so that in some way they can mentally prepare for it. So it doesn't come as a complete shock when they arrive at the host country. Some of the athletes, relate to it and absorb it. Some, when they get there and they see all these other athletes in different uniforms representing different countries, some go into, if I can use the term, can go into a shank. So there's one female athlete in the long jump. She was so nervous. Her first Carifta Games in the under 17 age group. And so nervous, despite all the pre-Carifta Games talk and trying to not alarm them, but make the athletes aware. She couldn't even get the correct foot on the board to take off with. And at times the coach has to know when to say something and when just to be quiet, where the experience itself was a lesson strong enough that the coach didn't have to say anything. But the athlete was upset. But more importantly than that, she was resilient and she was determined in her training that continued to not only qualify for the next year at Carifta, but do better than what she did. And then the following year at Carifta, in the same age group, she won the gold medal. You have to provide opportunities to athletes to gain experience, sharing that, learning that. I'm going to make reference to a triple jumper, and you with that, saying that, you'll probably know who I'm talking about. Went to his first Carifta Games in the under 20 age group. That was in Barbados. I know there was something like maybe 12 or 14 athletes in the triple jump that year. All the athletes are given 3 jumps, and then the top 8 athletes after the first 3 rounds are given an additional 3 jumps. That athlete didn't make the final. He came up, I was watching the triple jump, he came up, sat beside me. I didn't need to say anything. I could see the expression in his face. I could read his body language. And that athlete, similar to the female triple jumper, was determined that next year, his last year in the Carifta Games, was not going to be one where he misses out on the final. He just didn't like the idea of not competing in the final, not being in the mix with the top 8. And that athlete trained diligently. What I asked him to do in training, there was no doubting, there was no fight against it. That year that he didn't reach the final, he jumped a PB of over 47 feet, less than 48. But the next year, Earl, he won the gold medal at Carifta, improving almost 5 feet from what he did the previous year. He then went on to win the silver medal at the Junior Pan American Championships. He qualified for, at that time known as the IAAF World Junior Championships in Greece, and he qualified for the Commonwealth Games that were held in Scotland that year, 1986. So again, it goes to the point, you have to provide athletes. You see an athlete out there training, being diligent, committed to it, and the opportunity comes where he can or she can represent, you have to consider that. You weigh up a few different things in the consideration process or in the selection process. I can tell you about another young man. He's with us in your program right now. His first year Carifta in Jamaica. He was so nervous also.
Beanie, you were nervous.
As a young teen. But after that, learning from that experience, again, so nervous, at times wasn't sure, the rhythm in his run-up was off. But subsequent to that, and other Carifta Games, he won medals in the long jump, triple jump, came close to winning medals in the sprint. You have to provide athletes. You look at an athlete, you recognize them. You get a sense of, do you think this athlete can handle it? I'm not talking about winning a medal, but just going out there and benefiting from the experience. That was sort of what I wanted to have it. So when we talk about those athletes at NACAC championships was huge. Most people would have heard of Shawnee Miller-Rebo.
Mm-hmm.
Most people would have heard of Sharika, is it Jackson from Jamaica?
Mm-hmm.
Most people would have heard of, I think, Akeem, the sprint, Blake, from Jamaica. These are all people and others from world championship level, from Olympic Games level, who were at the NACAC championships. Do we expect in some events our athletes to be on the same level? probably not at this stage, but give him the opportunity
Mhm.
was most important. I talked to a parent of one of the athletes today. Said, Mr. Swan, coming up in the car from the airport, the talk that my son gave was so different from other occasions when they've talked about his competing, whether it be for the college, etc. It was all so positive, right? No, he said he didn't run the time that he had hoped to run, hoping to do a PB. He didn't apply the pre-race strategy that was talked about or discussed, but his talk and that whole journey home from the airport to wherever they lived in the western part of the island was so positive. What he had learned, um, the things he now needs to examine, what he can embrace and look at in his training going forward. So those are points that you've heard Dr. Evans and Coach Bean mention.
Yeah.
Having the opportunity, learning from it. In terms of getting to the question you asked me, okay, what can be done? Interestingly enough, I think Coach Bean and I talked a little bit about this. I made a little suggestion to him. I'm not going to tell you what that suggestion was. I'll let him if he wants to. In terms of possibly some things that could be done here at home, in terms of certain activities with coaches, so that everybody's on the same page in certain aspects with training athletes. So whether athlete comes from a young athlete, a youth, to junior, to senior, they would have been exposed to some of the important skills and drills and wouldn't be becoming familiar to them when they get to the national level.
Mhm.
So those are some things, looking at. Because you're a sprinter, well, you got to run. Or certainly you better be prepared to run. If you're a jumper, you got to know how to run. Certain aspects, if you're a thrower, hurdler, you should know how to run. So yes, mechanics and all of those things become important. Um, Coach Bean did something when we were in Bahamas. We had a team meeting. And normally from previous experience, the officials may share information formally, although the athletes know formally with what somebody on the team had done that day or in their preceding session. He changed it up a bit. Instead of him talking or me talking or a manager, Allison Otterbridge, talking, he asked athletes, share some thoughts with what you think about your competition. And surprisingly, there were some really honest comments. And to make some comments in such a public forum, like to all the teammates and team management, for some that may take some courage, some nerve. And so to hear some of the comments, like one of the athletes said, I got to work on my arm action a bit better. Now, another athlete said, well, my technique is improving, but I've got to become more stronger, more powerful than what I currently am, along with a few other things. So to answer to your question, first, there's recognition by the athletes to some of the things they need to do to improve, to move better, to become better. And then, of course, Coach Bean and I have talked as well about some possibilities to other things as well.
Sure, sure. Well, Coach Bean, when we see our track meets and then we see our athletes outside of the environment of local activities, where do you recognize their balance? Because as you guys know, I go around a lot of sports and I see our athletes who are comfortable in Bermuda, but when they get out to the unknown, it's a bit of discomfort. So how do you identify that, and what are some of the things that you try to instill in them that you're still got to compete?
One thing that I could remember a long time ago from Coach Carol Simons and especially Coach Swan, it's okay being the fastest in your neighborhood, fastest in your school, fastest in your country, your island. But ultimately, what each athlete, rather whatever sport you're participating in, is to become the best in the world, at least for most.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could hold your own outside of these shores, then you can come somewhat say you've arrived.
Mm-hmm.
And too many of our athletes, like you say, become comfortable because, yeah, I know I could beat her, I know I could beat him, and so forth. And Mr. Swan says getting them to compete regularly outside of Bermuda, because it goes into a different mental state. Because if you're lining up at, say, Delwood Sports, and like I said, if you know, you can know this person and you can know how this person runs, yeah, your adrenaline is down. But once you step outside the shores and you see this person, you've heard of them, or you might not have heard this person, your whole mindset changes. Your whole race pattern might go out the window because you're used to being in front, and now you're in the back. You might not. I'm seeing times at track meets where athletes haven't even heard the gun go off because they're so nervous. So it's just echoing what Mr. Swan said and Dr. Evans said, giving these athletes the opportunity to compete outside these shores more and more, so it becomes second fiddle. Um, as we all know, the hard work is done at practice.
Mm-hmm.
So competition comes around, your body should be automatically into autopilot. But sometimes that's the reverse because they don't have enough opportunity to subconsciously get into that mode, if that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah.
If I'd like to add to that, Earl, this is the end of the season for most people. And one of the things, apart from rest, you need to rest at the end of a demanding year, busy year. And so the body recovers, emotional recovery, psychological recovery. But at the same, also, you use that time to do what I call reflective analysis.
Mm.
Reflect on your season and you assess, okay, what was strong, what was good, what were some of the things that are weak that I need to work at. And going to your previous question, okay, what aspect of my mechanics needs to be worked on? My posture of the trunk, movement of my arms, recovery cycle of each stride, my leg. Um, so it's more to it than just running and putting one foot in front of the other. So to be more effective, to try to run faster, mechanics, technique have to be made better. Consistently good training. The seek for perfection is always being sought. You know,
Yeah.
so now once an athlete has had rest, and then we get into the general preparation period for the 2023 season. It's during that period when some of those weak aspects should be worked on and be able to, hopefully over time, with sufficient work and regularity at repetition, they gradually take that aspect from a weak part of their execution and get it transferred to the good part or strong part of the execution. So that's sort of an addition to the question you asked previously as well.
Sure, sure. Dr. Evans, Devon made mention of it, that the BNAA is in a very peculiar position with so many of the athletes abroad in either boarding school, colleges, universities, or whatever. But them seeing competition on a regular, they'll start the season off, especially track, it will be indoor and then moving to outdoor. But what are some of the availabilities for the on-island athletes to have similar competition, or, not well. I know because it costs a lot of money, but on a sub-regional basis, to have that challenge and see what the development is over a 2-month or 3-month period, where they go to an event and then they go to another event in a period of time just to see what the mechanics, have they worked them out, have they, that type of thing.
Well, Earl, we're trying to plot out the calendar and ensure we have opportunities before our Carifta and everything else. I think that's the role of myself and the board, is to ensure we have opportunities. December 3rd, we're going to have our cross-country championships. So we'll begin the cross-country series in November. With that, we're going to invite 100 athletes off the East Coast, high school athletes. Now, we won't have a lot in that age group, but we're hoping to encourage more, and those opportunities bring more people out. But, it'll be somebody like Jada Grant to run against on our home soil, and she'll turn up and turn out because that's the kind of athlete she is. At least Dickinson, who hates cross country but loves competition, she'll show up and show out. So that I believe that's really the role of the board, is to ensure we can create competitions that allow the coaches' work and investment in the athletes to bear its fruit. Before we've taken athletes back to the Bahamas for Star Chasers. That's a real possibility for next year. We've taken kids to Miramar, Florida, to Speed Classic. In fact, I really believe, and Devon can weigh in on that, I think that for our younger athletes launched a bunch into exceptional seasons. Think of Miles and where he ended up the year, Jada Grant, where she ended up the year, Elise, where she ended up the year, Jaden Grant. It finished bad. It finished badly because of injury, but he was rolling. So we plan to do those kind of things to give athletes the opportunity to continue to compete and demonstrate they're going to be ready for Carifta.
Mm-hmm. And Devon, listening to Dr. Evans, I mean, as we all have indicated, it's getting that mental part. I know for some athletes, just training is one thing, but having a carrot dangled in front of them is something that they could strive towards. So in your training aspect, what is that carrot? Describe that carrot of what you're telling these young athletes, because they have to have something that they're working towards, and it can't be just, quote unquote, it can't be just Carifta.
Well, that's a good question. And some of those carrots might vary.
Yes.
And as a coach, you have to know each individual athlete and what makes them tick.
Mm-hmm.
I can sit here and say, when Mr. Swan was coaching me, Mr. Swan knew me so well, he can turn me on and off like a light switch. That's how much Mr. Swan was between my head. Next to my mother and father, he was the next most important person in my life, because he instilled such self-belief. And coaches have to have that with their athletes. You have to, it's a matter of gaining their trust. If you can, and Mr. Swan and I talked about this in a meeting separately and with the athletes while we was down in Freeport. It's an athletic marriage, and coach and athlete have to be on the same page.
Right.
But you have to trust the coach in all what he's trying to do and all what he's trying to get you to do in order to bring the best out of you. So that could vary. I remember Mr. Swan's carrot for some of us, when he was in demonstration shape, a little much younger, he used to have competitions with the athletes, and he'll be like, okay, well, I'm going to set a mark out here. Whoever wins gets a Vitamalt or Snickers or beef patty. Nowadays, the children are a little different. You have to kind of up the ante, so to speak. So sometimes if I have and you have to use your discretion. Sometimes I'll put under a coon $5 or $10, or I'll offer to buy lunch or anything. You gotta use your imagination to get the athlete aroused and, like you said, use that carrot. And it becomes fun. And sometimes I have to stagger because it's men against women or boys against girls, and I have to give them a fair advantage, right? So it becomes very exciting, very interesting, and the smack talk starts. It's amazing, man.
Earl, let me add something to that. And it's just sort of an elaboration on what Coach Bean has said. It's difficult if you're the sole one or two athletes in an event. And here in Bermuda, it's difficult at times. So the coach has to try a couple of different things to keep that interest. First thing you want to start off, okay, what's the goal? What is our goal for the upcoming year? You set a goal. That's what the goal is. So everything we set in training is geared to that. So it's not about, well, in part, yes, it's about getting the athlete to put trust in you. But that trust has to be earned. The athlete has to see your commitment to it. And you being, as a coach, prepared for every session. You know, you're spending time outlining the program each week. And sometimes you may have to tweak a session in a particular week because of reason A, B, or C. So you set your goal, and then periodically you may have trials. After 6 or 8 weeks of training, okay, let's have a trial. You should be at this point, if you've been doing not only what we have in sessions together, but sessions you've been made to be responsible to do on your own. Like you got to go in and put your miles in, your distance in, and you cover that in a specific time. So I had ways of sort of measuring that. So having goals, doing trials. I had a couple of athletes, and like Devon said, after they'd done the session, I might throw out a challenge to them. One guy caught on to it. He said, "No, I'm not going to take that challenge. I see what Coach Swan is doing." And others say, "Yeah, I can do that. But Swan, I can beat Swan. Swan's old. I can beat him." And so I used to throw things. Okay, what about him? Maybe about a 6-pack of ginseng, or what about a lobster dinner? I think some of those athletes still owe me dinner or lunch ginseng from all the
Adam, call him.
In fact, I was talking to one of the athletes back in June, and we were talking about that. And he does some coaching. He doesn't live in Bermuda now, does some coaching elsewhere. And he said to me, "Jerry, whenever I coach, I think of you. You know, some of the things you had me do as an athlete, I do with the athletes that I now coach, because he recognizes from his perspective it served him well." So my role was sort of complementing what Allison Outerbridge and Devon Bean did. And if there was something I saw or thought needed consideration, I would approach Coach Bean. Coach Bean, despite all my experience, he was the senior coach. And that I respect. So some things I may have indicated to him or suggested, or what you think, Coach Bean, in that regard.
Sure.
So,
Mr. Basic, before you go on, let me tell this story, because it's something significant that's always stuck with me, and it took me close to 15 years to figure out, particularly on hard sessions before I left the shores of Bermuda, whether it's 300s or hill sprints or what have you. Mr. Swan used to come to me and some of the other athletes just after we finished the line, crossing the line. And he used to ask us to do math problems in our head, or recite our address, like little different things like that. And I'm looking at him, huffing and puffing. Is this man crazy? Why is he asking me, okay, and he'll give me something that was gonna, not just a regular timetable, he'll put a decimal in there. What's 2.3 times this? Anything like that to throw your mind off. But it wasn't until I took a psychology class, sports psychology class at university, what Mr. Swan was trying to get us to do. As you know, when you get across the line, you're huffing and puffing. But when it's time to do an interview or you got to really think about something, it causes you to bring down your breathing.
Yeah.
It's helping us to recover. I didn't know all these things to fit. And it just dawned on me. I remember calling him when I was at Long Beach. I said, Coach, I know what you've been doing all this time. And now I do that with my athletes, and they're looking at me. I mean, they'll probably be watching this now and figure it out. But I will always remember that.
Sure. And I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad that Mr. Swan touched on it, because my last question would be this, Mr. Swan, and I'm going to ask you to run the same thing. As a coach, you're still, with all the knowledge you have, you're still learning different ways to coach and implement things. So at the NACAC championships, what is something that stood out for you from another coach that you can actually utilize in your coaching activities now?
I'll share something that I have done, and even as recently as the NACAC championships. Regardless of the international competition, CARIFTA, to Olympic Games, to World Championships, to World Junior Championships. And particularly when athletes have a session, or it might be just a quiet time during that session or after the session in particular, and they might be cooling down, warming down. I'll observe what other athletes may be doing. And I'll examine and scrutinize maybe a drill or an exercise. I say, okay, why are they doing that? Does that have merit? Does it make sense? So as a coach, I'm always looking to learn, to incorporate things to complement my repertoire of different techniques I would have, or skills or drills, activities that I would have athletes do. Some that I see say, no, I dismiss that. I wouldn't entertain it. Others, okay, if I think that has some merit, I'll analyze it and say, okay, I can see what it's doing, whether it's developing core, whether it's to do with increasing or battering sprinting mechanics. And at the NACAC championships, I did a similar thing. Sprinters, hurdlers. I have been doing work. I did work for the past maybe 3 or 4 months, 4 months with a young female hurdler who hadn't done any hurdling at all prior to this year. So I was asked if I would come and assist with that hurdler. So you're observing Coach Bean, what's the hurdler's name? Charlton from Bahamas.
Oh, Devin Charlton.
She was also a medalist at the World Championship. She was a bronze medalist. So she was one of the world athletes there. So I just watched her in the session a couple of times when I had that opportunity. Certain mechanics, certain hurdling drills, as well as other hurdlers. Okay. Do I like that? Is that good? And most of the stuff is quite good. So to me, you should always be learning. You learn through observation. And need be, you can learn through asking. My source is observe, analyze, and whether to accept or reject. And if I accept, I look at incorporating in some way with the other things that I'm doing with the athletes that I coach. Or maybe this would be a better skill or drill than maybe one or two I'm currently using, etc. So, as far as I'm concerned, if you're being involved, you're always looking to learn,
Sure.
etc. And then also share that information.
Yes.
Share it with Coach Bean, etc. On occasions, I've been asked I would be approached by maybe one or two of the other athletes other than Coach Bean. If I could come up and look at this athlete, make some observations, give some feedback. And I'm willing to do that and have done it. Right? At times, I may observe something with an athlete or some of the athletes Coach Bean is coaching. And I'd go over to him and I'd say, listen, this is my observation, A or B or C. And Coach Bean may say, Coach Swan, go and mention that to the athlete. Sometimes hearing a similar thing or same thing, but from a different voice, a different person, and can make the impact. So if I can sort of do a little summary, Earl, we had 10 athletes at NACAC. Roughly 2/3 of their group experienced their first senior international competition. And what made the competition even a high level, because you had some Olympic athletes, Olympic finalists, Olympic medalists, world championship athletes, world championship finalists attending. There was also prize money. So that's going to entice people who may normally go over to Europe, may be more receptive to coming and participating in the meet. We had Akeem Blake, who won the 100, sub 10 seconds. You had Noel Lyles' brother,
Josephus.
ran the 200, but he came second. Third, was it?
Yes.
So I say that. So we had 10 athletes, 6 of whom competed in their very first senior international. You heard Dr. Evans say earlier, 1 or 2 with COVID, etc., first opportunity to compete. So from my perspective, if they gave it their best shot, but more importantly, learn from that experience. And I have no reason to doubt that every athlete, including Janai Parent-Chief, who earned a silver medal, Sakari Famous, one increment away from challenging for a medal. Dash. So I'm mentioning now the more experienced athlete in the group, but they've had limited exposure to international competition, very limited. So they're still on a learning curve. Oh, come on, Devon, help me. The thrower.
Tiara.
Tiara DeRosa.
Yes.
And I should remember that because I've been working with her for a bit. Tiara DeRosa handled this competition because you had discus throwers who were throwing over 60 meters, just as competitive as Commonwealth Games, but did better. And one of the things she said is she didn't let the level of competition get to her as had happened at Commonwealth Games. And it goes back to our point that we've got to provide athletes with competitive or competition exposure so they can develop their level of confidence. It can help sharpen and shape with that confidence better tactical aspects of their execution. One of our athletes in the sprint race got a good start. It said she stumbled mid-turn, and at that level of competition, it's very difficult to recover in a race that short. So I think our athletes did well. Young, and I hope I get his name right, Suresh Black. That's one of the athletes Coach Bean works with. And He had an excellent meet. He ran a PB in the semifinal. And keep in mind, Earl, this was, again, he was in that group, which is the first exposure to senior level international.
Mm-hmm.
In the 200, did a PB, qualified for the final, came back and ran even quicker in the PB and finished in 7th place. That's done a world of good, in my opinion, to his confidence. All you got to do is listen to him talk. Listen to what he's talking about for next year, what he's got to work on. You know, in terms of developing his certain biomotor qualities, improving his working at improving his strength, becoming more powerful. So it was a good learning experience. I just hope I contributed something to the team effort on the occasion we were in Freeport, Bahamas.
Sure. Devon, what was something you take away from the NACAC championships?
I believe your question was going back to your previous question that you asked, Mr. Swan. It's two things that stood out that I've watched. And as a coach, you come up with your own way of making soup or your own blueprint. And one thing that stood out to me out of the two, I see a lot of coaches walking and talking to the athletes before they get ready to warm up. So walking alongside of them, and I've never did that. I've just like, yeah, go ahead, warm up, and come back, observe your drills and your stride and so forth. But I've noticed a few coaches just take a nice stroll before the athlete gets into the main part of the warm up, and you just see them chatting, trying to put the athlete in that frame of mind. So that's something that I'm gonna start doing. I think is beneficial. And on the other part was I've seen athletes do it, and I would say the Jamaican athletes kind of revolutionized this style of starting. And it's a low heel drag or toe drag as they come out of the blocks. And it's something that I didn't quite understand what they were trying to do, and I don't teach it because I didn't see the significance of it. But I see more and more athletes do it. And some of the best athletes or faster starters right now, whether it's male or female, do it. So I picked the brain of a friend of mine who coached a former world record holder, Dalilah Muhammad, my friend Lawrence Boogie Johnson, and I asked him, I said, hey, why do coaches do this start? And he explained to me the significance of it. And if you do it right, it could shave off. It basically alters it stops you from running fast too early. And as you know, the person that decelerates the least normally wins the race. So what this does is prolong your maximum velocity. I'm gonna go get technical on you. Maximum velocity later on in the race, so you decelerate least. So those are two things that I think going forward I'm gonna kind of mess around with, pick Mr. Swan's brain, see what he thinks about it, because in theory it's counterproductive because you're creating drag. Your foot literally drags on the floor. It's not supposed to do that, but oftentimes athletes do it. But Asafa does it, Usain does it, Shalian does it, Elaine does it. So it's got to be something there. But some other athletes don't do it, and they run just as good too. But but learning from the NACAC region, I think our athletes, they held their own. Something they could be proud about. Their families could be proud about. Coaches, Bermuda as in entirety could be proud about. I think most of the nerves have subsided. Mrs. Swan reiterated what Tiara went through at Commonwealth when she saw one of the athletes throw over 60 meters and she just been in a shock. Lo and behold, a few weeks later, same thing happens. So that previous experience is learned from, so she knew how to handle it. That sort of thing really made me feel good. But I said in a previous interview early on today, that the highlight of my NACAC experience was Dr. Evans, Allison Otterbridge, Mr. Swan, and I. You can see the athletes have had a level of calmness, so to speak. They trusted us. They trusted everything we said. We didn't even have to. They were older athletes. We didn't have to babysit them, or overshadow them, so to speak. We just laid the ground rules down, what our expectations of them were in competition and out of competition, and it was a wonderful experience to feel that connection between the whole entire supporting staff of the athletes. And as you can see, the most of their performances echoed what we was trying to get them to do.
Sure, sure. And Dr. Evans, I'm going to end with you about a similar question from the NACAC standpoint or administrations of the regional presidents. What pressure can they, or what more can NACAC do for each organization to improve the quality of competition for small countries? I mean, you have a lot of those countries that they could hop to each island and compete against each other, but we're in a very peculiar, but not alone in our position.
Absolutely. Before I get to the question, I'm going to take a point of personal liberty. I think we touched on every athlete by name, but we left out Ryan Outerbridge by name. I think Mr. Swan was describing him in the car ride.
Yes.
But Ryan had a terrific tournament too, and he's one of the ones we are going to see this help him to mature athletically. He has grown personally and mature as a young man, and he's a very strong athlete, and this is only going to make him better. So I didn't want him to go without being recognized. Indeed, because that's his word. Indeed.
Indeed. Right back.
It was a great ride back. Indeed. I'm pleased that the region is doing outreach to, and also World Athletics, to try to help us continue our maturation and growth. They can't be successful organizationally unless the weakest link is successful. You need competition. You got to have somebody to come and run against Usain Bolt, or you don't have a race. So they are looking at creating competitions and support, and even economic support to help us to develop. And so we're going to continue to keep those lines of communication open and try to do that. And then finally, Mr. Swan eloquently described the history and all of that. And my connectivity to that is I married into it. My wife is one of those generational athletes he was speaking of, who went to Jackson State and found me, made me come here. Subsequently, we had our son Aaron, who Coach Swan developed, and he earned a scholarship and was a world-class athlete and went to Commonwealth. So I'm not, when I talk about, and then even helping me as an official. So when I talk about Coach Swan, it is with a passion, because I have a lot of respect for everything that he's done. Devon is his athletic son, and I was Devon's teacher, and we were teaching together. And so just that whole connectivity of the synergy of being back together, helping the athletes and having that vision that, we all that passion to help our kids do the best they can is just special. And that's going to help us become the regional team we want to be. We are not going to be winning career by medals, but we're going to have athletes that turn heads and find college scholarships and come back and hopefully compete representing Bermuda and then contributing to our community. And that's what we strive to do.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you.
Dr. Evans, if I may, one point, and I hope I'm not talking out of order here, but Dr. Evans was introduced to a coach who coaches a number of world-class athletes. And that coach has indicated that he would like to bring athletes to Bermuda. I'm going to leave it at that. If Dr. Evans wants to say more, he can, but he knows what I'm talking.
Well, I know we're way over time, but yes, we're going to continue to do the things that help to give our athletes opportunities for competition. And Coach Swan's absolutely right. He introduced me to a gentleman, and Devon knows him quite well, and he's becoming a legendary coach in the horizontal jumps, and so we're definitely going to take advantage of that too. But Earl, thank you. I know you're trying to wrap this up.
No worries. No, I'm feeling fine. I just want to really thank you guys for sharing. I know a lot of times when competition is going on, you try to get as much as you can out, but giving you the platform tonight to really express how grateful you were for the athletes and looking from where we came to where we need to go and how we plan to arrive there with these athletes of today. I think it's important that we have this type of conversation and continue these conversations, and hopefully the message gets to the athlete and their significant parents, because without the parents driving these kids to the track, getting them there, making sure they're committed, making sure they're doing their extras and all, as well as the schoolwork that goes along with it, to give them the opportunity to get a scholarship, to become that person that they want to be. I think we're on the right track, and I want to encourage you to still reach out. We can have these conversations on a regular. If athletes, you want to bring athletes just so they get confidence in talking in person and in front of people. Those are the small things that we can help with, and I would encourage them to do so, and encourage the Bermuda National Athletic Association to make sure that those athletes get that opportunity. So,
yes, sir. I
Alrighty.
heard that loud and clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Gentlemen,
you, Mr. Beerson.
your night. Thank you very much for joining. Have a
Yes,
good night.
sir. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.